Welcome to this video on the Cambridge AS Music Listening Paper Syllabus 9483. In this video, we will discuss Section A of the paper, which is based on compositional techniques and performance practices. Now, in order for you to do well in this section, you really need to know all the elements of composition and performance practice. So, for example, with composition, you need to know and understand structure, textures, melodic devices, harmonic devices or compositional techniques, cadences, modulation, secondary dominant chords, and so on. For performance practice, you need to be able to explain the use of tempo in compositions, the interpretation of ornaments, the use of dynamics, articulation, pitch, and the overall sound of performances. It is also very important that you know particular terms that are used to describe some of these elements. In this video, I will go through these two different parts of Section A using exam type questions that are normally asked in this question. Now let's go on to question number 1. This question will be based on one of the prepared pieces you would have learned for that year. So for example, in 2021, the two different set works are Corelli's Concerto Grosso, Opus 6 number 8, which is also known as the Christmas Concerto, Sebastian Bach's Orchestral Suite number 3, BWV 1068. Now, the first preparation you need to do is to be able to familiarize yourself with these two set works. Spend a lot of time listening to them and know them. Right at the top of question 1, you are told the work that is being referred to in that question. You can get questions that ask you to identify the movement that particular question is coming from. You can also be asked to give features that are typical of that movement. So for example, if the movement is a sarabande, you can be asked to name features typical of a sarabande like slow dance, 3 beats in a bar, and so on. You can also be asked to name the movement that comes after the one played or the one that comes before that. Now, this is where you really need to be able to listen and know the order of the movements within that particular set work. You can be asked about instruments playing at a particular point within that same extract. Now, moving on to question number 2. This will be based on a piece of music from the Baroque period which is not part of your set works for that year. This question will focus on compositional techniques. Now, let's move on to some of the questions that are asked in question number 2. You can be asked to name certain melodic devices. The most commonly used melodic device of the Baroque period is sequences. So this can be ascending sequence or descending sequence. In general, a sequence is a melody or sometimes a harmony figure that is repeated at a different pitch. If the repetition starts on a higher note, it becomes an ascending sequence. And if the repetition starts on a lower note, it becomes a descending sequence. Now here is an example of an ascending sequence. And here is an example of a descending sequence. Now, other melodic devices that can be used in the Baroque period include broken chord passages, arpeggio patterns, and so on. You can also be asked to name harmonic devices, or sometimes they just call them compositional techniques. Now, some of the harmonic devices normally used in the Baroque period include the use of suspensions, modulation to related keys, dominant or tonic pedals, circle of fifths, hemiolas, and so on. Now, a suspension in music is a means of creating tension by prolonging a consonant note while the underlying harmony changes, normally on a strong beat. Here is an example of a suspension. A pedal note is a sustained tone, typically in the bass part of the ensemble, While this note is being sustained, the chords at the top will be changing. It is then called tonic pedal if the note that is being sustained is the tonic or the first note of the key. And it can be called the dominant pedal if the note that is being sustained is the dominant or the fifth note from the tonic. Here is an example of a pedal note. Now, circular fifths is a sequence of keys and their root chords, where each key of a chord is a fifth from the previous chord. Here is an example. Now, another question that can be asked here is to describe the role of an instrument or instruments at a particular point or between some bars in the music. Now, here it is very important to realize that most of the music that is used for this question involve the use of concertino and ripieno sections. Now, the first thing you can do here is to analyze whether the instrument is playing with this concertino or is playing with the ripieno section. Moving further, check whether that changes, and if it does, tell us which new role the instrument takes and where within the extract does that change. Remember, concertino is a group of instruments playing the solo and ripieno is a group of instruments playing the accompaniment. Also, look at the rhythm that is being played by that particular instrument. Does it play the same rhythm? Is it playing broken chord structures? Is it imitating any section? Or is it harmonizing another instrument and so on? These are some of the points that you need to raise when you're comparing or when you're talking about the use of an instrument within a particular section. You can also be asked to describe the structure of an extract that is being played. Now, this question usually comes with 4 to 6 marks awarded to it. It is important that you discuss the different structures and trace the changes to these as the music progresses. It's important here again that you follow the score as well as the audio to be able to give a detailed answer. If the music has a concertino and a ripieno section, the first thing you can mention here is actually that it is a concerto grosso. You can confirm this by looking at the score insert provided. You will notice that per musical system, there is a group of instruments given on the upper part. These instruments are the concertinos or solo instruments. Then the remaining instruments playing the ripieno are the accompaniment. You can go on to talk about the tempo of the main sections. For example, some concerto grosso extracts will have a slow section and then followed by a fast section. Check if there are any distinct sections like a fugal section. Also mention which group is playing these distinct sections. For example, if there is a fugue section, mention the instruments that play the first, the second, and third, and the fourth entry, and so on. You can also mention the general entry and exits of certain groups of instruments and the bars in which that happens. Now, you can also get a question that asks you to comment on the structure of the music and how that changes within the extract. Now, remember here that we have different terms that we use to describe the texture of music. For example, we have homophonic, polyphonic, monophonic, and so on. It is also important for you to remember that music from the Baroque period also uses different textures like imitation and antiphonal, which is also called call and response. It's important to note that you can have two different textures within the same bar. For example, within a concerto grosso, you can have the concertino playing homophonic texture while the ripieno section is playing in a polyphonic texture. You can have an antiphony or call and response between the concertino and the ripieno sections. With this question, always check what's happening in the concertino and ripieno sections separately. Then also check if there is any similarities or relationship between the textures in these two different sections. Other questions you can expect here are naming cadences like perfect cadence, imperfect cadence, plagal cadence, or interrupted cadence. You can also be asked to identify the key the music would have modulated to at a particular point within the extract. Now, moving on to question number 3. This question is in 2 parts, and in total it has 15 marks and is based on performance practice. You will be asked to compare 2 performances of the same music in this question. Question 3a will ask you to comment on a specific aspect of performance practice. It can be tempo, articulation, instrumentation, ornamentation, and so on. Question 3b will then ask you to compare the same 2 performances but focusing on other aspects that haven't been asked in question 3a. To help you answer these 2 questions effectively, I will talk about each element separately and what you should look out for as you listen to these performances. Let's start with tempo. Here, look at how each performance interprets the initial tempo marking given. Usually one of them will be faster than the other. You need to mention which one was faster or slower than the other. If the extract is divided into 2 sections, talk about which one is faster in the new section. If there are any tempo changes within the extract, like ritardanto, check if both of the 2 performances follow that effectively, or whether one slows down earlier than the other, or whether one of the performances doesn't change at all. There's so much that you can talk about on tempo. Also check if the performances follow a strict tempo or the speed fluctuates here and there within the movement. Now let's move on to articulation. It is important to note that regardless of what the initial instruction on articulation is, one of the performances will tend to be a little bit more legato and smooth, while the other will be detached. Some will have a variety of legato and staccato notes. If they are wind instruments, you can talk about how they are tonguing the notes. It's either they tongue the notes smoothly and connected, or they tongue detached. Also check if there are changes in these different ways of articulation. Now with pitch, you need to check which performance is a tone lower than the other. The one which is higher will be using modern instruments, while the one which is lower will be using 18th century instruments or copies of those. With instrumentation, now here most of the differences will be in the instruments playing the continuo part. If the music is scored to be played with a harpsichord, some performances will use a real harpsichord while others will use a piano. Other elements you can talk about to get higher marks in this section is the balance of the orchestra. Check whether the orchestra was well balanced or not and mention the performance which was well balanced. Also, overally, talk about the performance which was closer to normal expectations of historically informed performances. Usually that performance is the one that used 18th century instruments, meaning it was performed using Baroque standard tuning of instruments. Now, to wrap up, I will give you 2 exam type questions with answers at the end. Good luck with your exams.